the way in which Sinatra gets involved with this story, he experienced a severe throat problem that really affected his career, and his recording and movie companies dropped him. The only people that really supported Frank Sinatra during this low point in his career were friends in the mafia, hot spots, nightclub owners that were willing to still have Frank appear in their places.
Do you think that Kennedy was then associated with the mafia because of the ties with Frank?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. His father, Joe Kennedy, people say he's a bootlegger, and I don't know if there's really any firm evidence to that effect. Joe Kennedy was big time in the liquor industry, but that's after Prohibition. But Joe did know some of these characters. For instance, with Johnny Roselli, Roselli claimed that he would play golf with Joe Kennedy out in Hollywood. So I think, Joe Kennedy was not unfamiliar with the world of organized crime, which is part of the entertainment field and such. I now have 2 hit primetime television shows.
It's a big deal.
My books.
Yay. Listen, 2 more than I do.
Ain't bad.
Ain't bad at all.
So, yeah.
And today, we're going to be talking about one of 2, which is going to be Mafia Spies, produced by yourself, Tom Maier. I got that right.
Okay, that's right.
I'm super intrigued, number one, by everything that goes on in the docu-series, essentially about Mafia's involvement with taking down Castro in Cuba. But for me personally, a little backstory.
Sure.
My dad and I, with the whole Johnny Drinks brand that we started, the first video we ever posted was my dad was making a Manhattan cocktail. And I figured I'd film him, put it on this app called TikTok, because why not? And I was going through the playlist of music I can select. I selected Frank Sinatra's, I'm going to blank on the name right now, but a Frank Sinatra song, and then it blew up on us. So our entire brand from there on out was classy cocktails and pair with Frank Sinatra music.
Oh.
At that point, I was never a big fan of Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack or 50s jazz at all.
Right.
My dad was, and his dad was. So I inevitably became a fan of Frank. And now I'm so intrigued by his involvement, not only with his music, but also with the mafia. And I figured today would be the perfect opportunity to hear more about just the intrinsics about what went on truly during that time period.
Well, I was really interested in, I've always admired Sinatra's his abilities, vocal ability. I think he's one of the great singers of the 20th century. And I think he's made a big impact. Writing the book Mafia Spies, somewhat coincidentally, did pique my interest even more in Sinatra. He's an integral part of this whole story. Mafia Spies is about 2 gangsters who were hired by the CIA during the Cold War to kill Cuban leader Fidel Castro. Now, that's a simple sentence, fundamentally.
Sure.
But from there, it goes to a number of different avenues. And one of them has to do in Las Vegas. Those 2 gangsters that I talked about, one was a guy named Johnny Roselli, who, and the other one was Sam Giancana. Giancana was the head of the mafia family in Chicago that's known as the Outfit. And so he actually became very good friends with Sinatra. And that's how Sinatra really gets involved with this whole story. But he also is friendly with Johnny Roselli. Roselli was the mob's guy that was in Hollywood for a number of years. And then he was working in Havana with Giancana and another gangster outside of Havana at a casino that the mob owned. The mafia actually owned a number of different casinos, arguably ran the whole entertainment field in Cuba prior to Castro coming to power. But Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana knew one another all the way back to the very early days as young drivers for Al Capone. So that's how far back it went. So what we're talking, though, in Mafia Spies is the late 1950s and the early 60s in particular. This is where the bulk of the story takes place. And Johnny Roselli in Hollywood, the mafia in Chicago got him to move into Las Vegas more and more, as they did. This is after World War II. And that's where he gets to know Frank Sinatra. And so does Sam Giancana. And Sam Giancana goes back with Sinatra probably to like the late 40s. The way in which Sinatra gets involved with this story is in a couple of different ways. But as a singer, he came from the whole area of Hoboken, New Jersey.
That's right.
And he hit it really big. And so during World War II, he had a number of hits. But around 1950, in that area, he experienced a severe throat problem that really affected his career, and his recording companies and movie companies dropped him, and so the only people that really supported Frank Sinatra during this low point in his career were friends in the mafia, people that were mobbed up. Hot spots, nightclub owners that were willing to still have Frank appear in their places. And so as he recovered, he did recover, and obviously he recovered, but he was in a movie in 1953, and he got a part that at least according to Hollywood legend, part of it was thanks to Johnny Roselli. Roselli helped him get the part. It was in a movie called From Here to Eternity. And Frank just was a natural for one of the parts. And he wound up winning the Academy Award.
Wow.
So by that point, his career was back on the uptake. But Sinatra was a loyal guy to his friends, and he was always loyal to the mafia, those casino owners, people like Sam Giancana, who were instrumental in keeping him afloat during the bad times in his career.
Yeah, and which reminds me of the quote I remember in the series of his involvement with the mob. And he says, the mob owned the nightclubs. If the nightclubs were owned by cardinals and monsignors, I would have hung out with cardinals and monsignors. So the obvious no-brainer for him is that he's going to hang out with the guys that supported him. But why did they support him so much?
Well, I think they identified with him. I think that during that time period, there was an element of, even with Kennedy, of a lot of immigrant white ethnic Catholics who were coming of age. Certainly John Kennedy was arguably the first minority president of the United States. And he really represents, in fact, I wrote a whole book about this about 20 years ago, about how the Kennedys were kind of represented the Irish Catholic immigrant experience in the United States.
Sure.
But I think with Frank Sinatra, who was very much caught up in John Kennedy's 1960 campaign as well, and I think that was all part of it. These were people who were the either immigrants, the children of immigrants, or sometimes the grandchildren of immigrants, who felt they were outsiders in society, who wanted to be part of. They were tired of having their nose against the glass there. They wanted to be part of main society, big time society,
right?
And people of talent. Joe DiMaggio, as an example, during that time period, he was a big hero in the Italian American community, and Sinatra was as well. So that's kind of where Sinatra is coming to, and putting him in the right historical context.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you looked at it from like today's day and age, right? You take a president, you take a famous singer, let's say like a rapper, and then you take a gang, right? Like the Bloods and the Crips, right? Because a lot of times rappers came from the same neighborhoods and maybe they were involved and they'll associate with one another. But what doesn't happen is that you rarely have a president endorsing both the singer and the gang. Do you think that Kennedy was then associated with the mafia because of the ties with Frank?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. His father, Joe Kennedy, people who say he's a bootlegger, and I don't know if there's really any firm evidence to that effect. Joe Kennedy was big time in the liquor industry, but that's after Prohibition. And he actually had a secret deal that I've written about, that he got the British liquor rights. But Joe did know some of these characters. For instance, with Johnny Roselli, Roselli claimed, and I think this is true, that he would play golf with Joe Kennedy out in Hollywood. Joe Kennedy, the Kennedys lived here in New York, actually, this area. They lived in Westchester County. They were from Boston. But Joe Kennedy, for about 10 years, was a movie producer. And he would go out every so often to Hollywood. And so Johnny Roselli claimed that they would play golf, that he had played golf, like part of a foursome and such. Mm-hmm. So I think, Joe Kennedy was not unfamiliar with the world of organized crime, which is part of the entertainment field and such. So the Kennedys... there was, as far as their involvement with Frank Sinatra, there was a key moment that's detailed in Mafia Spies, and it's in Las Vegas. It's about 1960, early 1960, during the presidential campaign, and Kennedy takes kind of the weekend off and to relax, and he goes to a casino in Las Vegas where Sinatra is appearing along with Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr., the Rat Pack. Yeah. This group of friends and performers known as the Rat Pack. And part of that Rat Pack, though, was a guy named Peter Lawford, who was an actor. And Peter Lawford was the brother-in-law of John Kennedy. So it's during that weekend, hanging out with his brother-in-law, Peter Lawford, that he gets to hang out with Sinatra and the Rat Pack. And Sinatra becomes very prominent in the Kennedy campaign. He does a song.
Yeah. His jingle was Frank Sinatra's, right?
Yeah. He adopts a song called High Hopes, mm-hmm. and he adopts that into, they change some of the lyrics, and they make that into a 1960 Kennedy presidential campaign song. Yeah. And there's TV ads with, March for Jack, and we're all for Jack, and it's all part of that High Hopes song. Mm-hmm. So they become really fast friends. But during that same weekend in Las Vegas, John Kennedy is introduced to a woman who's a big figure in Mafia Spies. Her name is Judy Campbell, and she was a young woman who was from the Los Angeles area, who met Johnny Roselli at first. Actually, she lived in the same. She was a divorced woman by that point, but still in her 20s, who met Johnny Roselli, who lived in that same place, a place called Garden of Allah, which I always liked the name of that place. It's a place where a lot of actors and actresses would hang out. But then Johnny dated her and introduced her to Frank Sinatra, Judy Campbell. And then Judy, by this point in early 1960 in Las Vegas, Judy's joining Roselli, Sinatra, and she is introduced to John F. Kennedy. And that's where they begin what essentially becomes a 2-year affair between Judy Campbell and the future president, then running for president, Senator John F. Kennedy. And that's been pretty well documented. And we mentioned that certainly in Mafia Spies.
I do remember that. And that's what caused a lot of the anger and jealousy towards between the two of them, correct?
Oh, yeah. Anger and jealousy, sexual jealousy particularly, is definitely a factor in this story of Mafia Spies in a couple of different respects. And so there are some key moments where Sam Giancana got very jealous about a comedian trying to become the boyfriend of Phyllis McGuire, who was a well-known entertainer back then, and she had been going out with Sam Giancana, and so that was part of the whole jealousy thing. Mm-hmm. With Frank Sinatra, what was really interesting is, and I have this in the book, we don't detail it quite to this extent in the TV show, but in my book, Mafia Spies, the kind of the go-between, what the CIA called a cutout, the person that would deal directly with the mafia on the behalf of the CIA was a guy named Robert Maier. And Maier is one of the more fascinating characters. There's a lot of fascinating characters in Mafia Spies, but he's the guy who helped set up the whole deal here to try to kill Castro. He was a former FBI agent. And by that point, he had gone into business for himself. And his number one client was a guy named Howard Hughes, who was then the richest man in the United States. Hughes did a lot of government work, and he was a contractor for the government. But he was the richest man in America. And Robert Maier worked for Howard Hughes. So early on in Mafia Spies, one of the first things when I introduce Maier as a character, I recall that Howard Hughes went out with an actor. Hughes was not only a government contractor, but he also was a Hollywood producer, and he did a number of different films. But he dated a beautiful woman by the name of Ava Gardner. And Ava Gardner was somebody who dated Hughes for a while and then met Frank Sinatra. And eventually, Ava Gardner and Sinatra married. Frank wound up divorcing his wife and getting married to Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner is an inspiration for a lot of those saloon songs of Frank Sinatra that really made his greatness as an artist. Those songs that he did, particularly in the 1950s. And
do you have an example of some songs?
Yeah, there's a whole series of songs in the around 56, 57. They're saloon songs. It's 2:45. The place,
This guy's got pipes over here. You can sing.
A little bit, yeah. So those type of songs, where if you've ever been in a bar late at night and you're crying in your drink about how she done you wrong, or maybe you done her wrong, or whatever.
We've all been there.
But those type of late at night when you're all alone, you're thinking about how the dice has not come up for you, and those type of things. And you play Sinatra, and his songs really were not only symbolic of that era that he lived in, but I think that's really part of the eternal greatness of his music, because I think those songs in particular still play to the heartstrings of anybody who listens to them. And I also think the Rat Pack and that type of music, and how he changed his music from the kind of the sweet type of sound that first made him popular right around World War II. By the 50s, it's a different sound. It's a more aggressive sound. There's almost with certain songs, he belts it out. There's certain violence almost as an undertow to his music, and so that Rat Packy era of Frank Sinatra that really made him terrifically famous. I think that was also influenced in a way by who he was hanging out with at that time period, and certainly part of that crowd was Sam Giancana.
And without getting too derailed, I'm just curious about Frank Sinatra's journey as a singer. Where do you think he was at the top of his top? Was it early 50s?
Yeah.
And that was during the Rat Pack days?
Yeah. I think from roughly 52 to about 1965, 66.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, with 66, he does a couple of songs even after that, New York, New York. But in 1965, he does Strangers in the Night, and that has that classic. I mean, I think that was a number one song in 65, 66. And by that point, the Beatles were out, but it was such a great song. And it was so quintessentially Frank that it just rose to the top. But I think in terms of the body of his work, the great work, I think, is from 1952 to about 1965. I have to say that in Mafia Spies, we have James Kaplan, an author who wrote a 2-volume biography of Frank Sinatra, and James Kaplan is in Mafia Spies.
Wow.
So I kind of defer to his expertise, and I
expert.
think his book is a terrific book. And anybody interested in Frank Sinatra would be really wise to buy those 2 volumes. It's really a terrific biography, and it's very comprehensive. And he does indeed talk about Giancana and Johnny Roselli in his books as well.
Got it. What is your favorite Frank Sinatra era?
Well, that time period. I think when he sings the Great American Songbook, when he sings songs like, particularly written by Cole Porter. Cole Porter was not only a great person with melody, but he also wrote really terrific lyrics. There's a song, I Concentrate on You. Whenever skies turn gray to me and troubles begin to brew, and then he says, I concentrate on you. Well, I'm not Frank Sinatra.
You're good, though.
Well, thanks.
That was impressive.
Well, I'm not very good with lyrics.
We meant to have you sing.
Yeah. Well, but when you look at that song, the construction of that song, it's just really brilliant. Cole Porter went to Yale. He was a very smart guy, but he wrote some of the great theater songs, musical theater songs, and so Sinatra was a great interpreter, I thought, of those songs. In fact, Porter, as I understand it, one time chastised Sinatra for adding different lyrics to his songs. That don't touch my songs.
Wow.
I want you to sing them the way they are. But Sinatra, I think when you look his great work, I think a lot of them were classic American songbooks songs. And I think that's also a reason why they still last and still resonate with people today. And Cole Porter, I think, is certainly one of them. There were certainly other people, but I really like when Sinatra does Cole Porter because it's smart, it's lively, it's sophisticated, it's quintessentially New York. And Sinatra, he's a New Yorker. That's fundamental. He certainly traveled all over the world and lived out in Palm Springs, California, towards the end of his life. But he grew up in New York. He's got that New York. I mean, that's why people love when he sings New York, New York.
Yeah, which is so amazing now that here in the timeline that you're saying that was at like the tail end of what his hype was. I mean, did that like reignite a hype in Frank Sinatra singing New York, New York?
Well, I think he had difficulties finding songs. With Sinatra, I think what happens is not only the Beatles, but music changes. And suddenly he goes from being at the cutting edge to looking like an old guy in a tuxedo there, and he's losing his hair, and then he gets married to Mia Farrow, who's a woman about 20, 30 years younger than he is. I think there's even pictures of him in a Nehru jacket and stuff like that. It's kind of funny when we look back at that whole era of that hippie era of like the late 60s, early 70s. But I also think he was losing access to a lot of songwriters. The best songwriters were often writing songs on guitars rather than, not everybody was guitars, but the way that songs would be constructed on pianos with that sophistication. I don't think he had as many people. Cole Porter was long dead by that point. So I think New York, New York came out of a Martin Scorsese movie that starred Robert De Niro and Liza Minnelli.
Which one?
New York, New York was the name. Yeah, it's called New York, New York. And at the end of the movie, there's a big number, New York, New York, and Liza Minnelli, who plays an entertainer in the movie. That song was adopted by Sinatra.
Oh,
yeah. And even though Liza Minnelli certainly is a popular singer, it was Sinatra who made that song ultimately famous.
So that wasn't even his song.
Yeah, I think about the at the end of every New York Yankee baseball game, at the end they play Sinatra. That was something that I think the owner then, George Steinbrenner, insisted on. But he's the one who really made New York famous.
It's crazy looking back now. Obviously, you look at him and he is timeless, but you never really think about the end of his career, because when it is at the pinnacle, people probably like, there's no way he's ever not at the pinnacle. He had such a hold and presence on the space that I can only imagine what it was like to watch him, unfortunately, I guess, like have his bit of a downfall and lose his voice and not able to perform the way he once did.
Yeah. I think that also later on in his career, he definitely drank a lot. That whole crowd drank a lot.
Yeah.
And I think there was a price to be paid for that. And they also smoked. So between smoking and hard liquor, the body's not going to tolerate that for too long. And with in his case, you can see the modifications that he made in his voice. Not that he would talk through songs, but at times he was almost at that point, really late in his career. And when I was a young reporter, I worked for the Chicago Sun-Times, and there was a big festival in Chicago, summer of 1983. And Sinatra entertained there, and I was assigned to cover it. And I remember listening to him. And, those songs that he did, New York is one of them, but there were a number of songs that he would belt out. Whereas the songs from the 50s particularly, he still had it. I think he had it, the full grasp of his abilities. I think he had that up until about 65. There's a great concert that CBS had in like about 65, Sinatra the Man or something like that. And it's a great performance by him. But I think when he's really in full measure of his abilities, that's really from about 52, 53 to about 1965.
Yeah. As you saw him perform in the 80s, it was...
Yeah, he was an older guy. Yeah. I mean, it was heroic. In fact, as a fanboy to some extent, I took my parents and my lovely wife, Joyce. We went to the Jones Beach Theater, and by that point, we sat up in the nosebleed seats. It was really hard to get seats, but I just wanted to say that I actually went to see Sinatra, and my parents... we're of that era.
Right.
And so we went to see him. And, it was definitely the last days of Pompeii. He was an older guy. He was belting out the songs. And you can orchestrate things to help support an artist. And he always understood that... because I think he was a terrific actor as well, that storytelling, the narrative, the lyrics in a song are really, really important. As much as you may, even if you are off musically, melodically, that if you are putting over the lyrics, you're telling the story, you're imparting the emotions of a song, that you can still get away with it, and that people won't notice it, and that they'll still, because they'll be captured, you'll captivate them with your ability to tell a story in a song.
I wonder, me personally, like, again, you go back to those days and he's still listened to, and I wonder if you comparatively had like the listens of Frank Sinatra versus, like, say, the Beatles, who gets listened to more now versus then. Right. I'd be curious. But.
Well, he did do that song Somewhere, which was written by George Harrison, and it's a fine song. If you ever go do karaoke with Beatles songs, they're not necessarily easy to sing. Whereas the American classic songbook, which often comes out of musicals, that's something that, and I think even today, musicals like Wicked, for instance, people sing Frozen as an example with karaoke, and I think American musical theater, which is one of the great art forms that America created, along with jazz, for instance. I think those songs, they wear well over time. They're meant to wear well.
Yeah.
And, in the hands of somebody like Sinatra, they become real classics.
Yeah, that's a good point. Getting back to the involvement of Kennedy and the Mafia and Frank Sinatra, do you think during the time, it's almost like this weird dynamic where on one end, the Mafia almost gets more publicized and legitimized by being supported or aligned with Kennedy. But do you think it ever flopped where people looked at Kennedy as potentially corrupt or a criminal because of his involvement with?
Well, in Mafia Spies, there's a lot of things happening. The two gangsters, Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana, they agree to try to kill Castro.
Wait, is that all public? Like, do people know this at this point?
Yeah. Well, it's certainly public now,
Right.
because it's a 6-part series on Showtime and especially Paramount Plus. But it wasn't known by virtually anybody for about 15 years in this country. It's a big top secret thing. But it came out after the Watergate scandals, and in which people began to question what the CIA was up to, and also the FBI. But it was the CIA, and they learned about this whole top secret thing in around 1975. In other words, the plot to kill Castro.
Can you explain the Watergate scandal?
Sure. Well, the Watergate scandal happened during the administration of Richard Nixon. And essentially what he did was he set up a band of people who, one of whom had worked in the CIA, a guy named E. Howard Hunt. But they broke into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in a building called the Watergate. It was like a big apartment building. And they were caught by a night watchman who called the cops, and then they caught the guys. And then as they went through the criminal justice system, they realized that they had been paid by the committee to reelect, by President Nixon's re-election committee,
right,
which had all this money to play with. And so it became a real detective story. There's a great movie called All the President's Men that's based upon a book of the same name, written by the reporters who broke the scandal, really developed it. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. I worked most of my life as an investigative reporter, and they're always one of my heroes for doing that. But so after the Watergate scandal, which wound up in the resignation of President Richard Nixon on August 9th, 1974. I remember August 9th. That's my wife's birthday, so it's stuck in my brain there. But after that, in the fallout from Watergate, they said, okay, what's going on with the CIA and all this stuff? And so the U.S. Senate had hearings about that. And that's when they learned that in the early 60s, about 15 years earlier, that the CIA was trying to kill Fidel Castro and tried several times, but they had also enlisted the Mafia, particularly these two guys, Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana.
Why the Mafia?
Well, what happened in that time period is the United States government, which after World War II was very preeminent, we were the first to develop the atomic bomb. But then the Soviets very quickly, somewhat through spying, learned about how to make a bomb, and so we went into what was called the Cold War. And the Cold War, which took place in the late 40s actually through about 1980, till the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, I believe it is. So it went on for a long time, but it was basically where two armed countries with atomic bombs were toe-to-toe, eye-to-eye with one another. And in the late 50s, the Soviets were the first ones in space with a satellite called Sputnik, and that really rattled things in Washington. The idea, well, wait a minute, maybe the Russians could put one of those atomic bombs on the top of a rocket and shoot it away. And, that really, particularly the people that were making the decisions there, that was something that Hitler tried to do late. That's what they feared at the end of World War II. So when that happened, and then Fidel Castro wound up taking power in Cuba, and was willing to put some of those atomic bombs and rockets in Cuba, only 90 miles away from Florida. They said, we have to do something about that. So President Eisenhower authorized the CIA to, one of the phrases was to saw off Castro.
Eliminate, right?
They used all these buzzwords, to liquidate, to eliminate. They didn't say to murder, which is exactly what they meant. And so they enlisted the mafia because a lot of the guys that ran the CIA, particularly a guy named Allen Dulles, he was from Princeton. Other people were from Yale, but they were all a whole bunch of Ivy League types. They didn't want to get their hands dirty. They didn't want to have bloodshed. But they were more than happy to authorize somebody to go kill Castro. And so they were aware of Robert Mayu, who we talked about before. Mayu had actually spied on Frank Sinatra, by the way, with Ava Gardner, as I mentioned, on behalf of Howard Hughes. But he became very friendly with people in the CIA. And they said, well, maybe we can get Mayu. And they approached Mayu. Mayu thought about it. Do I really want to get involved in murder here now? I'll do dirty tricks for the CIA and such, which he did do. But so he eventually says yes. And so they set up this whole thing. There was a big meeting at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Florida. And at that meeting, you had Mayu, you had a guy from the CIA, and you had the two gangsters, Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana. They also brought in another gangster. They all used aliases, by the way. And it was, they all were kind of toying with each other and seeing if, but eventually everybody put their cards on the table, and essentially at the Fontainebleau, the same time period that Sinatra was entertaining. Actually, he was putting a TV show together that starred Elvis Presley. Presley had just gotten out of the military. And so there's actually on YouTube, you can find a clip of Sinatra and Elvis singing together. That's awesome. But during that same time period, it's all from the Fontainebleau Hotel down in Florida. This is around March, April in that time period, early 1960. And Eisenhower's still the president. But it's decided, yes, we will try to kill Castro. And everybody agrees that that's what they're going to do. And so they talk about, should we use machine guns? But eventually it's Sam Giancana who says, look, the best way to do this is to try to poison Castro. And we think we still have people that we know from our days in Havana, running the casinos there, that maybe would be able to get close enough to Castro to try to kill him. And, the story of Mafia Spies is almost like whack-a-mole when you go to an arcade with a big mallet and you keep on trying to hit the rat that jumps out of the hole or whatever it is, the gopher or whatever. The mole. Well, it was the mole. Of course, that's why they call it whack-a-mole. But that's kind of like what happened with Castro. And they were kind of befuddled about how was it that that we're not having any luck killing him.
Right.
And a lot of Mafia Spies deals with that. A lot of my investigation for my book, Mafia Spies, relies on documents that came out about 5 years ago. They were related to the JFK assassination. And though those papers really didn't say anything directly about who killed JFK, what they did provide was a lot of information about the CIA's CIA's operation in Florida, where they were training Cuban exiles, and that's where the two mob guys, Giancana and Roselli, were working out of Florida, and that's where all of this was happening down in southern Florida. And those papers really provided a lot of detail. I have to say, it was a big eye-opener for me, because even though I had written 2 books about the Kennedys previously to this, I was not aware of 2 things. One, of just how much we were running a war in southern Florida, in the Miami and in the Keys area, involving Cuban exiles, but the CIA training attempts to overthrow and kill Castro. That was, I didn't realize the extent of that. The other thing that I learned was that the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, who was JFK's brother, and had been put into that position. And Robert Kennedy was and is a hero of mine. There were a lot of great things that Robert Kennedy did, but I have to say, when I look back on this, it is amazing that the Attorney General was going down to Florida and basically overseeing this attempt to overthrow and kill a foreign leader, Fidel Castro.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of detail in my book about that, as well as in the TV show Mafia Spies.
Do you think these two, Johnny and Sam, had to get permission from the families of the mafia to do this? Like, or do you think it was a...
Theoretically, they did. They didn't. They decided not to tell. You know, these were 2 guys that thought, if we do this favor for the CIA, we'll kind of get, like in Monopoly, the get out of jail free card. And so they'll be immune from prosecution. If we get in trouble, don't worry, we'll make a phone call and we'll get out.
Sure.
And that was their anticipation. That was not the case. And for reasons that become more and more obvious as we go along in the story of Mafia Spies.
Yeah. And just from my understanding, the mafia was pretty prevalent in Havana prior to Castro. And then once Castro took over, they smashed all the casinos down.
Well, these days we are so accustomed to Las Vegas. What goes on in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. But that whole spirit, and Las Vegas really doesn't get off the ground until late 40s, early 50s. And even then, it was still nowhere close to what it is today. So during that time period, during the winter months in particular, if you lived in Chicago or New York or Philadelphia, any place, particularly on the East Coast, during the winter months, you'd go down to Havana. And it was a country essentially where the entertainment was controlled by the mob. In fact, the dictator, his last name was Batista. This is prior to Castro. He put in a mobster, a very well-known mobster named Meyer Lansky. In fact, if you watch The Godfather, the character Hyman Roth in Godfather 2 is based upon Meyer Lansky. He was out of Miami. But Meyer Lansky owned the fanciest hotel in Havana, the Nacional. And Batista, the dictator, actually put Meyer Lansky in charge of the bureaucracy that oversaw all the casinos and such. So there was a lot of resentment in Cuba for this kind of rich Americans and the gangsterismos, the gangsters that were running these things. And then the poor people and the people that really didn't have access to this type of money that ultimately fueled the resentment that brought Fidel Castro to power with a revolution.
Right. Okay. So the civilians hated the mafia just as much as Castro did.
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't realize
in
that.
fact, I think Castro really rode that resentment to power.
Yeah. Now, what was again, we take a step back and realizing, like, you look at Castro now and you realize all the bad that he did. Was that the narrative behind it during? Like, did the civilians, some of them, like, appreciate Castro and look
we
up
knew
to him?
that Batista was a dictator, but he was our dictator,
Right,
in the eyes of American business interests particularly. But with Castro, we thought initially, well, he's a reformist. maybe he may be a socialist or whatever. But and he came to the United States to a big hero's welcome. The way the original media coverage was very favorable to him. He came up there. In fact, when he came to New York, there were kids wearing those type of Castro beards. He went to the Bronx Zoo. I think he went to the Central Park Zoo, but he spoke at the UN. And
So he was a hero at this point.
He was a hero. And then the way that we treated Castro was who wanted to nationalize a lot of the American businesses that were placed in Cuba. So that certainly rubbed us the wrong way, needless to say. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of argument about, was Castro always a communist at heart? And certainly within about a year or so, year and a half of power, it was very clear that the Soviet Union was more than happy to come in as the big brother, if you will, for Castro. And, to the extent that we were pretty early on trying to get rid of Castro, it was the Soviets who probably saved him personally, because the Soviets historically are great at spying. Winston Churchill with the British was great at spying. But even before them, the Soviets, the Russians, were really good at spying. And so they taught Castro how to set up, very, very quickly, how to set up a spy network, not only in Cuba, but as these documents, particularly that I've looked at in the last 5 years that became publicly available, what they make clear when you piece it all together is that there were informants and double agents that Castro had in Florida. Oh. So, for instance, when the Bay of Pigs happened, the Bay of Pigs was in April of 1961, in the first few months of John F. Kennedy's administration. Kennedy inherited a plan which was developed by the CIA, where the Cuban exiles who were in Florida and being trained, they attacked. They wanted to reclaim their homeland, and they went to a place called the Bay of Pigs. But when they did, Castro was already tipped off. He was waiting for them. Wow. And so, but there were a number of other attempts to get rid of Castro. There's a great scene in my book, but also in particularly in the TV show Mafia Spies, where Johnny Roselli, who was very actively involved with the Cuban exiles, training them and being involved in attempts to get rid of Castro, they went out in boats in the middle of the night, and they traveled the 90 miles in the dark to Cuba, to a particular landing point in Cuba where they had guns and ammo with them, and they were going to provide it to other people, other spies in Cuba already. But when they got there, Castro's security people were waiting for them. And there's a scene where they're shooting at Johnny, and the boat that he's in takes on water, and he has to jump out of his boat, get into another boat, and they all wind up fleeing, going back to Florida. Wow. Yeah, it's really pretty amazing there. But that kind of gives you an idea of, particularly with the CIA, they eventually put a guy who's known as the CIA's James Bond. His name was William Harvey. He's a character in Mafia Spies, pretty prominently. And they brought him in as their kind of like their ace to figure out, why aren't we getting this guy? What's going on? And when Harvey came in, he realized, well, there are definitely some rats here. There are some double agents. There's informants, that this Castro has already developed some methods of learning information coming out of Florida. Not only what was going on, stopping attempts to kill him in Cuba, but also what was going on in Florida. So that was really sophisticated spy stuff. And in putting together the book Mafia Spies, I kind of, all these various different documents, it just added more and more to the overall jigsaw puzzle of what happened and how it was that Fidel Castro, who was the target of so many assassination attempts, winds up saving and winds up dying only a few years ago as an old man in his bed at age, I think it was about 90. It's really an extraordinary story.
That is mind-blowing. Yeah, like he was, not only did he last all these assassination attempts, he lasted his entire life.
Yeah.
It was also mind-blowing to me. Why was it so easy for Castro to take over?
Well, he was a very smart guy. He was trained. He went to Jesuit schools. I went to Fordham, and it was also a Jesuit school here in New York. But he was Jesuit trained. He was a lawyer. He was also a pretty good athlete too. So he was, and what he did is he went into the mountainous areas of Cuba. And there's a long story about him and such, but essentially he goes there and becomes the leader of the revolutionary forces there. And just through the various different circumstances and the excesses of the Batista government, particularly if you've ever watched something like Godfather 2, where the Al Pacino character comes to Cuba, and it's pretty clear that there's trouble brewing in Cuba. In fact, I think somebody in Godfather blows themselves up just to try to blow up other people as part of a car bomb. And so Castro came at the right moment in history, and he was the right person for that. And how we responded, when we look back historically, I think it's really important for the United States to learn how to deal with characters like this. And Castro really is a good example of how not to deal with an emerging revolutionary leader in an area that we care about.
Right. Why wasn't, I guess, because again, you mentioned like Johnny and Sam both said, hey, if you want to kill him, you got to take him out via poison. We can't just go and shoot him. But why? Why wouldn't it be? That seems like the most obvious and easiest way to go about it.
Well, this was their business. Giancana and Roselli, somebody like Sam Giancana, he became the head of the biggest mafia family in the country. New York has got 5 families, but they're rivals and they're fragmented. In Chicago, the entity that was created by Al Capone was a really big, it was called the Outfit. It was a huge organization with revenues that were like comparable to General Motors. That's how much money. This was the height of the mafia, around 1960. Okay. So he's really riding high on all these illegal and also legal businesses that they were involved in. So, with Giancana and the mafia, they were able to control things.
And they probably didn't want to run the risk of being like publicly, hey, the people that took out somebody like Castro.
Right. I think the CIA, as I mentioned, that was run by Ivy League guys. They didn't want to get their hands dirty. And they would insulate things. The family's got a lot of buffers, they say in The Godfather. Well, a guy like Robert Mayu, who was a cutout, not a buffer, but essentially the same thing. He was a middleman, an intermediary between the CIA and the mafia. And so as a buffer there, the top heads of the CIA also, as a matter of duty, particularly the fellow who was running the CIA at that time, Allen Dulles, he made it pretty clear that we'll do things what the president wants us to do as good patriots. But if we get into trouble, we're not going to point to the president.
Right.
We protect the president. That's all part of the whole gig at that time period of running the CIA. And that's certainly something that Allen Dulles made it pretty clear at that time period. So there were a lot of buffers here, but it was a whole new world. And I don't think that we were that well developed as intelligence networks to understand what the Russians were doing with Castro and developing his spy network.
Yeah. Why do you think Castro never retaliated and tried to attack the U.S.?
Well, there was, for instance, there was an example that I quote that I detail in Mafia Spies, my book, about a guy that Castro did send, and he sent him to New York, and he was going to blow up a number of different sites in the New York area, kind of almost like a 9/11 type of circumstance. And the FBI lucked out. The FBI did a great job there, and they got wind of this guy, and they were able to capture him before he was in the United States. Wow. He came through the Cuban delegation in New York as like a translator or an information specialist. But actually what he was an assassin wound up by Castro to send a message. I know you're trying to kill me. Two can play this game.
Right.
And certainly Castro said that he said that in interviews a few months before JFK was killed. And so that's one of the things that certainly Mafia Spies looks at. We don't get into who killed JFK aside from what we know, the facts, and the pretty provable facts of that. It was Lee Harvey Oswald. Mm-hmm. But what was really interesting is that the Warren Commission, which was a 7-member commission that was set up by Lyndon Johnson, who was the successor. He was the vice president under Kennedy, became president with Kennedy's assassination. He set up the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission looked at the circumstances. That was their job, to look at the circumstances. Who killed JFK? And on that commission was a guy named Allen Dulles, who we've mentioned already, who had been the head of the CIA, who initiated the attempts to kill Castro, this whole plot. Right. After the Bay of Pigs and the fiasco of the Bay of Pigs, where Castro knew they were coming, and they wound up essentially taking as captives a lot of these Cuban exiles, and so we had to trade for them to get back. That was like a whole story in and of itself. But Allen Dulles was the guy who was in charge of all of this, and he was put on the Warren Commission. I know this is complicated, but I'm trying to make it clear that Allen Dulles, even though he was fired by the Kennedys because of the fiasco with the Bay of Pigs, he was put on the Warren Commission at the suggestion of Robert Kennedy, who suggested through one of his lawyers to Johnson that President Johnson put Dulles on the Warren Commission. So when they looked at who killed JFK, they looked at a number of different things, but they did not look at the plot with the mafia to kill Castro. And so you do a murder investigation, any murder investigation, and you're the cops, one of the things you want to do is identify all the possible suspects. But in this case, unfortunately, they really did not consider any involvement, or they were unaware, shall we say, of the mafia with the Cuban exiles in the plot to kill Castro.
Oh, because they didn't know this was public. Oh, okay.
Right.
I was about to say,
because this was top secret. They were worried. They kept it very, very top secret. And so it didn't come out until the mid-1970s, 15 years later, when they were looking at the CIA and they learned about all these other things after the Watergate scandal. So for 15 years, this big plot to kill Castro was essentially it was top secret. And so the Warren Commission didn't examine it. And so I think when we look back on it, certainly another member of that commission was Congressman Gerald Ford. This is in 1964, but by 1975, a decade later, Gerald Ford was now the president. And as all of this information came out, he learned that he was kind of Dinny the Dunce, as were the other members of this commission. They had not been told about this plot to kill Castro, and that he felt that they should have known about it, to at least consider it as part of their investigation.
Yeah, I mean, do you think Castro was involved with the assassination of JFK?
It's hard to say. He certainly said two can play this game. He certainly intimated the threat to try to kill Kennedy. But the unfortunate thing about what happened there by not considering it with the Warren Commission, that's the moment when you look at it. In other words, whenever you investigate a murder, you want to do it ideally within 72 hours, have a really good idea of who the suspect is. And unfortunately, they did not examine this plot. They did not know about it. And so we don't know. We don't know exactly about Castro. Was Sam Giancana involved in it? Certainly Bobby Kennedy thought about that initially, but he was assured that he knew an investigator up in Chicago who he called, and it was a labor rackets investigator that Bobby Kennedy knew, and he assured him there was no word on the street that they had been involved in killing Kennedy. But unfortunately, the fact that it was not examined by the Warren Commission, it really led to a House investigation of who killed JFK.
Right.
And all of these conspiracy theories. There was the movie JFK by Oliver Stone that came out. Great film, cinematically, but historically pretty flawed. And it really opened up the can to all of these conspiracy theories, some of which may have, they're pretty tantalizing when you look at it. But we still don't know if there was anybody besides Lee Harvey Oswald who killed JFK. And unfortunately, it looks like we never will.
I was going to ask you, what is the most taken to, I guess, conspiracy of why Lee Harvey killed him? Like, what's the most known story?
Well, Lee Harvey Oswald was a bit of a nut, or seemingly a nut, and who had at one point went to the Soviet Union, and they came to the conclusion he's a nut, and they sent him back to the United States, and he kind of hung out with pro-Castro groups. That's on the record and such. But was he somehow, as he claimed, he actually claimed, I'm a patsy. When they arrested him, he said, I'm a patsy. It's on film that he says that. It's a pretty odd statement for a murder suspect to say, I'm a patsy. Usually in a murder, they say, oh, I wanted to kill that person. Or, even in a whodunit murder, it's not often that somebody would say, I'm a patsy. And I'm sure that was all part of his claims of innocence. He was not innocent. He was clearly involved, and I don't think there's no doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald was involved in the assassination of Kennedy. But were the other people possibly involved? The unfortunate thing is we just don't know, and so with Mafia Spies, we deal with two assassination conspiracies or thoughts. One is a real conspiracy, the one that the CIA has acknowledged, and that's the plot to kill Castro with the Mafia. That's definitely acknowledged. There's no doubt about that. But later on in the story, Johnny Roselli thinks he's going to be deported because he is an illegal alien. In fact, Johnny Roselli is not even his real name. His real name is Filippo Sacco, and he's been trying to make sure that people didn't learn his real name his whole life. Everybody knew him as Johnny Roselli. And so when they tried to deport him, this is in the 70s, he kind of intimated that he may know something about the JFK assassination. And it was at that point when Johnny was supposed to testify that he winds up dead.
Come on.
Yeah. Well, both Giancana and Roselli, when they're subpoenaed by the Senate to testify about all of this, in the case of Sam Giancana, he's in Chicago. He had been for a number of years down in Mexico, but he came back to Chicago to live. And when he was subpoenaed, two investigators from the Senate came out to Chicago. And that same day, that evening, he had dinner with one of his daughters and some friends. They left after dinner. And Sam, he lived in a suburb of Chicago called Oak Park. And downstairs, he had kind of like a man cave when he actually had a stove. And he was making a late night dinner for himself of sausages and peppers. And through the back door came somebody with a silencer and shot him 6 times in the head, mostly around the mouth, which was kind of a mob signature statement of saying, well, if you talk like this guy was going to, you start squealing on us, if you're a rat, you rat us out, quote unquote, you're going to wind up just like him, dead. And that really shocked the Senate. But then with Johnny Roselli, particularly, Roselli testified initially with the Senate. He barely told them anything that they didn't know already about the plot to kill Castro. But then later on, as Johnny realized he was going to be deported, and his lawyer dangled the idea that he knew something about the JFK assassination, they subpoenaed him to come back. And before he could testify that second time, he was, by that point, was living down in Florida with his sister. He went to play golf, and he never came back. And a few weeks later, they found his body all chopped up, stuff in a 55-gallon barrel in the waters right close to the Fontainebleau Hotel, not far away from the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach, where the whole story started. It kind of ends at that place.
What a full circle ending.
Yeah, it really is. It's
so
amazing.
The mob, I'm assuming, took out both Sam and Johnny.
Well, who killed them? We don't know. Officially, both are unsolved murders. I think the person that is involved, if not directly responsible, is a guy, a third gangster. His name is Santo Trafficante. And Trafficante was based in Florida. He was in Tampa. He worked with Maier Lansky, but he was a big-time gangster. He spoke Spanish. He worked with Johnny and Sam in Havana before Castro took over their mob-controlled casinos. But they also recruited him into the plot to kill Castro. But was Santo Trafficante really a double dealer? Was he an informant? Was he a double agent? Certainly the FBI and law enforcement later thought, yeah, maybe he is providing information to Castro. So yeah, he's telling the CIA, yeah, I want to be part of the plot to kill him. And he's involved in helping make some of these arrangements to poison him. But when the poison doesn't work, as I mentioned, Bill Harvey, who was like the James Bond of the CIA, he definitely had a lot of doubts about Santo Trafficante. But by the late 70s, as all this was now coming out on the front pages and the TV news about the plots to kill Castro and these two gangsters, and now Trafficante was getting involved in it, he was very upset about that. And as far as when you trace the gun in Chicago that killed with the silencer that killed Giancana, when you trace that gun, it comes back to Tampa, Florida. It's not Chicago. The murderer of who killed Giancana must have heard the cops coming, but flung the gun with the silencer about 1.5 miles from Giancana's house. As the assassin is fleeing, he flings the gun, and they recovered the gun. And so it's traced back to Tampa, Florida. And in the case of Johnny Roselli down in Florida, he knew he had a target on his back. And he went out to dinner with Santo Trafficante, who he considered a friend. And it kind of reminds me of that scene in the original Godfather movie with Tessio, when Tessio is exposed as a double agent, as a double dealer. Yep. And he says, "Hey, Tom," to the lawyer for the Godfather, the son, and lawyer Tom Hagen. He says, "Tom, can you get me off the hook here?" or something to that effect. And it's that type of dinner. It's a dinner with Trafficante's wife there. Johnny Roselli brought his sister, who he was living with down in Florida, and I think his nephew, I think it was, as well. So they all went out to dinner a few weeks before Johnny winds up dead. So I think Trafficante has his hands. He was one of probably the slickest of all of the gangsters. Who are the main characters in Mafia Spies, and he dies as an old man as well, just like Castro. He's one of the last men standing.
And what was his real motive behind killing Johnny, if it was him?
Well, I'm sure. I presume that Trafficante told the National Commission of Gangsters, who were not told about this, and now it's out. Now 15 years later, now coming out in all the papers, that, oh, Johnny must have told you, or I thought Sam told you, or whatever. And so he was able to escape that. But, Trafficante was just really quite an amazing character. He was motivated, I think, a lot by drug money as well. I mean, I think he became an informant for the Castro government. From what I can see, and certainly from the suspicions that are on the investigative documents that I saw from, the people that were investigating this, I think they felt that the amount of money was so great. The drug trade through the Caribbean, through the Cuba, and which certainly had a lot of influence by Castro, that he had to do business with Castro. And there's even more details about this. Early on, somehow Trafficante, like other people who got lined up with a firing squad and got killed, Trafficante was jailed, but somehow he managed to get out of jail during the whole revolutionary takeover. So there's a lot of things. There's so many moving parts in Mafia Spies. I think the major achievement of my book is the fact that I try to make it as clear as possible, because it really is all these different rabbit holes. It fundamentally boils down to how the CIA hired two gangsters to kill Castro. But there are so many different tributaries, if you will, in this story. But it all eventually comes back to the fact that the two were killed. It's still unsolved to this day, and it raises a lot of really intriguing questions about the JFK assassination, the investigations surrounding that, how this attempt with the CIA and the Mafia to kill Castro kind of influenced the investigation of the JFK assassination. And ultimately, I tried to tell a story of these two gangsters together. I tell it biographically, so you never really leave the two gangsters.
Yeah.
You follow them through the whole story from beginning to end.
You do a great job, too, because as you're telling me these stories, I'm like rewatching in my head, like, oh, that's why he did this, and that's why this scene was portrayed, and it's making a lot more sense for me now.
Yeah, well, to me, I was aware of this for a number of years. To me, it's the great spy conspiracy story. That's true, really true, solid, really complicated, really fascinating. But there's a lot of books that have dealt with this. The way that I thought that I could bring something new was by using the two gangsters as a window. Most of my writing, Mafia Spies is, I think, my 7th book. Most of my books have been biographies. And so by using the two gangsters as a window into telling the story, I thought you could always follow it a lot more clearly, at least keep track of things. Yeah, you'll talk about what went on in Las Vegas, what went on down in Cuba, what went on in the CIA halls and down in Florida and all these different locales, Hollywood. But you never lose track of the two characters and their friendship. I don't know if you've ever seen a movie that was a big favorite many years ago called Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. No. But it's a buddy movie. These two guys were outlaws. They were interesting outlaws, particularly Johnny Roselli. The fact that they were two different men were also really interesting to me. Johnny Roselli was like this Casanova guy, very good-looking guy, certainly in the eyes of the various different very good-looking women that he dated out in Hollywood. He was the mob's guy in Hollywood, so he worked in the various different studio heads. He went out with people like Lana Turner, who was a big actress at the time. Yeah. Donna Reed, who was the star in that movie with Jimmy Stewart, It's a Wonderful Life, that everybody watches at Christmas. Yeah. But she dated Johnny Roselli, apparently. And also Judy Campbell, who I mentioned. Yeah. So Johnny was an interesting Casanova type. Sam Giancana was a different type of guy. He was more like a Tony Soprano, lived out in the suburbs. He was married and had 3 teenage daughters when his wife and daughters go to Florida on vacation. And particularly the oldest daughter was kind of a hell on wheels. She was definitely a real hellmaker for her parents, certainly for her father. And for her mother. And the mother, Sam's wife, dropped dead down in Florida, screaming at their oldest daughter, Antoinette Giancana. And ironically, Antoinette Giancana is about 88 years old, and she's in Mafia Spies, our TV show. Arguably, she might be the very best interview in the whole show. She's funny.
She's great.
She's really great, and she says a lot of things. She actually had the hots for Johnny Roselli at
And
a certain
her dad
point.
was mad about that.
Yeah, and she makes a favorable comment about Fidel Castro, and her father blows up.
Yeah.
You know, so Sam had a real short fuse. He liked to be married. When his wife dies, he starts hanging out with Johnny Roselli more and more in Las Vegas, ostensibly to look at the Chicago interest in all these casinos in Las Vegas. And he had known Roselli for a long time. But he also meets an actress named Phyllis McGuire there. And she becomes the new beloved one. And she was not one who was going to get married to Sam. Ultimately, she didn't. But she liked him, and she was, in her own way, loyal to him.
Yeah.
But he was always looking for a woman that he could put up on a pedestal.
Right. Yeah, listen, I don't get
Aren't
hooked.
we all?
Yeah, I agree. I'm right there with you. I don't get hooked on too many shows, and this one was thrilling. And I'm not done yet. I have a couple more. How many episodes is it total?
It's 6 episodes.
So I'm on the 5th one right now.
Yeah.
I'm almost there.
And you can find it just about anywhere these days. It's on Paramount Plus, number one. But right now you can see it on Showtime on demand. I know Hulu, you can find it there. There's a number of different platforms where you can find it that way. But those are the three.
Perfect.
Particularly, number one place to find it is Paramount Plus. You know, Paramount has done The Godfather. They produced The Godfather. They really are a place for this type of entertainment.
Yeah.
And you know, I definitely think that Mafia Spies is a great docuseries, but it's one of the great stories, true stories of our time. The New York Times just reviewed Mafia Spies and gave it a glowing review. So if you have any doubts about the quality of the show, go look up.
If you don't believe us, believe the New York Times.
Read the New York Times.
If you send me where they can find it, and I'll put it in the description of the episode. So
definitely will.
But this is great, and thank you for clarifying, clearing some things up that I had questions about the show, and I'm going to finish it up maybe even today.
Yeah,
but,
you know, in my book Mafia Spies, which is on sale now, and make sure you get the cover, the one with the cover for the show. It's the TV tie-in book, but I talk a lot about the relationship of Sinatra and the influence of Sinatra, the Rat Pack, and how Giancana, the friendship between Giancana and Sinatra in particular, found that in very detailed in both their FBI files. They both have very thick FBI files, and there's a lot of stuff about, you know, exchanging friendship rings. But I also thought that Sinatra, to get back with Sinatra's music, there's a change in Sinatra's approach, in my opinion, from the early days in the 40s, where he's kind of high up there. You know, the pictures of Sinatra with the bow tie, and it's very melodic. Whereas in the 50s, where he's hanging out with the Rat Pack and people like Giancana and such, I think that influences his music. It's got a more sharper edge to it. It's almost like a violent tone to some extent. But it's I thought even the clothing that they wore, with both of them, both Sinatra and Giancana wore a fedora, kind of a short fedora, and these shark skin outfits, and interestingly enough, Johnny Roselli looked like Dean Martin to some extent. There was that, to me, there was almost like a mirror image between the two, particularly with Sinatra and Sam Giancana. So certainly I explore that in great detail in my book.
In the book. Okay, got it. So we'll put a link for the book also in the description.
Yeah, please do.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This was a really fun time. I appreciate you coming here.
Great. I hope it.
Yeah.
Hope you enjoyed it.
If you want to give a quick shout out of where they can find you on any like socials.
Sure. Yeah, I'm on Thomas Maier Books. That's Thomas Maier, Maier books at Gmail. .com.
Yeah.
And also I'm on Facebook and TikTok and X. And
we'll put
Instagram,
it
all your favorite platforms. But you can buy the book at Amazon or go to your local store. It's a good companion. It's really a great companion to the TV show itself.
All right. Mafia Spies, everybody. That's it for today. Like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. Cheers.